back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and we're in particular going to look at Chapter 7 of Book 1. But before we do that, we should recap a few of the major points that we've made thus far. So we see that early in Book 1, Aristotle says what we need to do to figure out how a human being ought to live is to figure out what is the final or ultimate end of a human life. What is the chief good? Now, whatever this good is, it's something that's not only just worth pursuing, but it makes sense of every action you take. Whether the action is deciding when to go to bed, or what to eat for lunch, or studying for your exam, or choosing where to go to school, no matter what the action or decision or choice is that we're talking about, whatever this chief good is, it gives an explanation or answer to the question, why are you doing those things? Because you might say, look, I'm studying for my exam to get a good grade on the exam. I want to get a good grade to graduate from college. I want to graduate from college to pursue a certain career path, to make money, or feel fulfilled, or etc., right? There's a whole line or chain of succession of reasons why you do what you do. But then, at the end of the day, we might think, well, there has to be some sort of unifying principle. There has to be some ultimate aim you're attempting to achieve. And whatever that is that a human being should be attempting to achieve in an ultimate sense with their actions, that's what the chief good is. And Aristotle tells us that this chief good is happiness. And as I told you last time, really the philosophical debate begins when you consider the question, what is happiness? What does it mean to be happy for a human being? And I also told you that the English word happiness is really just a translation of the Greek word eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is certainly related to the way we commonly use happiness, but it also has, I think, a broader sense. I told you we can also think of eudaimonia as not just happiness, but flourishing, human excellence, and overall well-being. Right? It's a life that achieves eudaimonia is one that is an excellent human life, that lives a human life in the proper way that it should be lived. And we saw Aristotle go through some possibilities as to what this sort of end could be, what eudaimonia could be. And he says it can't just be a life of pleasure, it can't be a life of seeking honor, it can't be a life of seeking wealth, although he's not going to say those are bad things. That can't be what orients your life. It must be something greater. And in Chapter 7, we begin to see Aristotle make some more concrete steps toward telling us what that life is. We previously saw that he thinks sort of by process elimination, it must be a life of contemplation. But again, what are we supposed to be contemplating? What is this, and how is contemplation related to being happy? So in Chapter 7, we're going to see Aristotle make some moves towards answering those questions. Now, the first thing he does in Chapter 7 is he gives a little more explanation of the essence of happiness as a sort of final end. And one thing he tells us about happiness is that it's the most complete end. So he says we choose many things as means to other ends, right? Again, I said you study for your exam to graduate from college, to pursue a certain career, etc., etc. We choose certain actions or means for specific ends. But not all those ends are complete. So not all those ends or goals I just mentioned are complete in themselves. For instance, getting a good grade on your exam. Now look, you might say, well, this is something that is satisfying to me, a job well done. But notice also a lot of its value comes in a more practical way, again, of allowing you to complete this degree requirement. So pretty much every end you can think of, even if it does have some inherent value, also gets some of its value for its practical use. And for that reason, he says not all ends are complete. But whatever this chief good is, he says, is manifestly something complete. Whatever this chief good is, as he goes on to say, is worth pursuing for its own sake, is more complete than that which is worth pursuing only for the sake of something else. So the first thing about happiness is, imagine you were to achieve a state of complete happiness. complete human perfection, complete human excellence. Once you've achieved that state, you wouldn't find yourself saying, okay, well, this is nice, it does have some inherent value, but now it's going to allow me to get X. Now I'm going to use this happiness I have to get something else. Right? You simply wouldn't say that. It wouldn't make sense, because happiness as the final end is also the final destination. And although it's very unlikely we would ever achieve this state in a complete way, if we did, our work would essentially be done. So the first thing Aristotle says, whatever happiness is in and of itself, it's the most complete end. It doesn't require anything else to justify us wanting to have it. And for this reason, he describes it in a few other ways. He says, happiness is complete without qualification. So he says, honor, pleasure, intellect, and every other virtue we do choose for themselves. So he says, look, we choose pleasure because it's enjoyable. We would choose to be intelligent because there's an inherent value to being intelligent. We would choose honor because we enjoy honor for its own sake. But we also choose them for some further purpose. Just intellect's probably the clearest example, right? There is value in being intelligent for its own sake, but it also allows you to achieve many other things. So happiness, he's going to say, is not only valued for its own sake, but only valued for its own sake, and indeed, he says, not for the sake of anything else. And for that reason, he says, happiness is not just complete, but it's self-sufficient. He says, we take what is self-sufficient to be that which on its own makes life worthy of choice and lacking in nothing. So once you attain a state of happiness, there's nothing further you're trying to get, so it's complete, and there's nothing that's missing, so it's completely self-sufficient. Now this, as he says earlier in this passage, it doesn't mean that happiness means a life of solitary living without others, because he's going to say human beings are in fact highly sociable animals. We need to live in others with community to truly thrive. But he's just saying whatever it is that constitutes happiness, were you to completely achieve that thing, you wouldn't say, yeah, I'm happy, but there could still be room for improvement. No, it's a completely self-sufficient end. And so it's not just one end among others, it is the chief end. It's something obviously says complete and self-sufficient. So you might say, well, this is all nice, and essentially it follows pretty straightforwardly from the fact that Aristotle says happiness is the final end or chief good. But again, what is happiness? Now this brings us to the most important part of chapter 7. And it's the most important part because what we see in chapter 7 is what's known as Aristotle's function argument. Because remember, we need an answer to the question, what is happiness? What is eudaimonia? And in the function argument, we actually start to get a concrete answer. Not just it's not a life of pleasure, it's not a life of honor, but an actual concrete answer to what it is. So we're going to take this argument step by step. And so this is my outline of the various premises and conclusions of the argument. So P1, something X, and this is just this could really be anything that exists. Something X achieves its good or flourishes only if X accomplishes its function. Or another phrase he uses is its characteristic activity. So all this premise claims that if you take any object and you ask, well, how do we know if this object is achieving its good, if it's flourishing, if it's doing well, or if it's doing poorly? The question you have to ask is it achieving its function or not? So what would this mean? Well, this would mean like for certain objects which don't have functions, it doesn't make sense to ask that question. So like just take, for instance, a random stone you might find in the ground. Now certainly you can imagine there are uses or functions stones might have, but just put it aside. Let's say there's a random stone that really isn't serving any purpose. And you ask, is that stone doing well or doing poorly? Well, if it has no purpose, if it has no function, then Aristotle's going to say that's just not an apt question. That's not a question that makes any sense. Okay, so let's move away from something like a stone. Take a favorite example. Take something like a knife. So how do we know if this knife is doing well, if it's accomplishing its good, or if it's a bad knife? How do we know if it's a good knife or a bad knife? Well, if it's a good knife, it'll be sharp. It will allow you to cut things that need to be cut. Maybe you're using it in the kitchen to cut up some peppers or onions or whatever the case may be. If it's a poor knife, it's not going to be sharp. It's going to be dull. It might be dangerous to use, etc., etc. So notice this is just a pretty mundane example of a pretty simple object, but when we ask, is this a good knife or a bad knife, we're asking, is this knife fulfilling the function it has as a knife? And you can ask the same thing about more complex objects. Is your car getting you to work efficiently and safely, or are you constantly having to pull over to check the engine and becoming a danger to other people on the road? And even if we move away from human-made artifacts to forms of biological life, take an apple tree. Is it a good apple tree or a bad apple tree? Well, does it take in nutrients correctly? Does it grow nice and tall? Does it produce apples? If it does those things, it seems like it's a good apple tree. It's fulfilling its function. If it doesn't, it's a bad apple tree. So the first claim is that, first of all, there's really two claims here. First, that things have purposes. That things have functions. Things aren't just there randomly. Things have a certain purpose for their being. And Aristotle thought this in a very serious way. If you look at his cosmology and just his overall ideas about the universe, you have this idea that every single thing in the universe has a sort of function or purpose that explains why it exists. Okay, so that's the first claim, that there are these purposes. The second claim is that the good of something, or its flourishing, or its excellence, is constituted by accomplishing that function. A knife that cuts well, we don't just say, well, good, it allows us to get what we want. We say, no, it's a good knife. So, premise one just says that anything that is good, can be good or bad, or flourish, or do poorly, that's determined by its function. But the next question you should ask, well, is that true of human beings? Because that's what we're concerned with. We're not concerned with good and bad knives. We're actually concerned with good and bad human beings. And notice what Aristotle says here on this point. He says, for just as the good, the doing well of a flute player, a sculptor, or any practitioner of a skill, or generally whatever has some characteristic activity or action, is thought to lie in its characteristic activity, so the same would be true of a human being, if indeed he has a characteristic activity. So consider this, don't think about the human being as a whole for a second, but just think about a human being in one of its specific roles. So let's say you have a human being whose profession is to be a doctor. Okay, so, well, is this a good doctor or a bad doctor? Well, when patients come to see the doctor, does he or she help them get better? Does she cure their illnesses? Does she make them healthier? Or does she do the opposite? Does she give them bad medication, which leaves them worse off than when they originally came? Now, of course, if this individual as a doctor is making people less healthy and more sick, we would say that's a bad doctor. And a doctor that made them more healthy would be a good doctor. And why? How do we determine whether it's a good or bad doctor? Well, is the doctor accomplishing the characteristic activity of being a doctor? Which in this case is curing illness, making people healthy. So the point is, for any particular role that a human being has, we accept that the goodness or badness of that role depends on the function of that role. For a doctor, it's health. For a flute player, it's producing beautiful music. For a sculptor, it's producing beautiful sculptures. For a shoemaker, it's making shoes, etc., etc., etc. So, but here then is Aristotle's question. He thinks everyone will grant that. Right? Everyone's going to grant that in our particular roles as parents or professionals, we can do things well or poorly and we have a function. But what about the human being as a whole? Not the human being as a doctor or a lawyer or a parent or a flute player or a sculptor, but the human being itself. Does the human being itself have a function? And he is essential. His argument for premise one is that it would be very weird if in fact the human being didn't. So here's what he says. Well, do the carpenter and the tanner have characteristic activities and actions, and a human being none? Has nature left him, the human being, without a characteristic activity to perform? So he says, how weird would it be if we would have a purpose as our profession or as a friend or as a parent, but in terms of our lives as a whole, there's just no purpose? That would be rather odd. And he even goes back to just sort of the biological, natural world, and he says, or as there seem to be characteristic activities of the eye, the hand, the foot, and each part of the body, should one assume that a human being has some characteristic activity over and above all these? So notice we think the eye has a purpose to let you see well. The hand has a purpose to let you grab things. The foot has a purpose to allow you to walk and run and kick things if necessary. And we can identify good eyes and good hands and good feet and the bad versions of those. So every single individual part of your body has some purpose. Every part of your body has a function it's supposed to perform, yet you as a person would have no function? That just seems very strange. Why would nature give our hand a purpose and not give you a purpose? Especially when we consider the idea that in terms of purposes, your purpose as a human being, as a person, seems to be much more important than just the purpose of your hand. For instance, you can lose a hand, and you can even lose both hands, and while your life would be diminished, right, your quality of life would not be the same, you could still live a human life, and presumably you could accomplish whatever the purpose is of your human life. So because Aristotle thinks everything has a purpose, he thinks this is just the structure of the universe, it would be very odd to him if the individual components of our lives had purposes, but our life as a whole did not have a purpose. Okay, so that's premise one. Everything has a purpose, and everything flourishes to the extent that it achieves its purpose. Let's look at premise two. The function or characteristic activity of a human being is activity in accordance with reason. So we've established that everything has a purpose, and we determine goodness and badness by that purpose. So now, what is this purpose of a human being? Well, Aristotle asks this question. He says, what sort of thing might it be then? Now, the first thing he considers is just living. So he says, living is obviously shared even by plants, while what we are looking for is something special to a human being. Recall what Aristotle said about the life of pleasure. He said, a life of pleasure can't be human happiness because that's the life of a cattle. Non-human animals experience pleasure. Whatever our function or characteristic activity of our lives has to be something specific and special to human beings. And so it can't just be living, because many other beings live. We should therefore rule out life of nourishment and growth, right? It can't just be taking in nutrients and growing. Many, all biological entities, in fact, do those things. So that can't be it either. Next would be some sort of sentient life, but this is again shared by the horse, ox, and indeed every animal. So it can't just be living, it can't just be taking in nutrients, it can't even just be being sentient. It can't just be being conscious. So he says, what remains is a life concerned in some way with action. So notice all those previous things, just living, just taking in nourishment and growing, just being sentient, none of those things really necessarily imply action in any significant sense. Right? So, I mean, you might even say growth is a sort of action, but it's not the sort of action we think about where you're making a plan and goal and trying to achieve that thing, right? A flower takes in nutrients from the ground and grows, but in a very deterministic and sort of passive way. So the first thing is, one thing that's unique, at least separates human beings from plants, for instance, is action. But of course, animals act. So what's the difference? He says, a life concerned in some way with action of the element that possesses reason. And so what Aristotle is going to say is our human purpose is what he calls activity in accordance with reason. So what does that mean? Well, to put it plainly, it just means acting in a way that where you allow your actions to be determined by your reason. Whatever your human reason tells you is the best way to act, that is the way you act. And if you're doing that, then you are engaging in activity in accordance with reason. Now, of course, this leaves a lot of questions open, like how do we use reason? How does reason tell us what to do? And we're going to get answers to those questions as we move throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, especially into Book 2. But for the moment, we can see why Aristotle would fix on this as the human purpose. Because, and he might be wrong about this, but at least in his view, the only animal that can reason is the human being. In fact, he conceives of the human being as the rational animal. And so if this is what clearly separates human beings from any other species, then it makes sense that this would be our fundamental human purpose. Okay. So what is this? So this gives us a first conclusion. So the first conclusion of the argument, C1, a human being achieves her good or flourishes only if she acts in accordance with reason. So just as a knife does well when it cuts, just as an apple tree does well when it produces apples, just as a car does well when it transports you efficiently and safely, a human being does well in his or her life when he or she acts in accordance with reason. Now, given that this is the case, we can see how this, to a certain extent, supports Aristotle's implication previously that the happy human life is a sort of life of contemplation. Now, there are differences between reason and contemplation, but reason is at least an intellectual act. It requires our higher mental capacities. And so we see some similarity here between those two contentions. Okay, now, I'm going to just take a brief look at the second part of this argument, although we're largely going to be concerned with this point when we get to Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. But now that he's shown that a human being flourishes to the extent that she acts in accordance with reason, he then adds another claim. P3, a human being can only act in accordance with reason if she possesses the virtues. So let's see how he argues for this. He says, if this is so, and we take the characteristic activity of a human being to be a certain kind of life, and if we take this kind of life to be the activity of the soul and actions in accordance with reason, and the characteristic activity of the good person to carry this out well and nobly, and a characteristic activity to be accomplished well when it is accomplished in accordance with the appropriate virtue. So the good human life is the one that makes use of our reason well and in a noble manner. And what he's going to argue is that you can only do this, you can only make proper use of your reason if you have what he's going to refer to as the moral virtues. Now, at this point, when we get to Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we're going to have much more to say about virtue and moral virtue and vices, and so this point will make sense. But for the moment, I just want to highlight for you the way in which he's going to say our purpose is to use our reason, but in P3 he's claiming we cannot use our reason properly if we don't have moral virtue. And I can't explain to you at this exact moment why Aristotle thinks that, but when we get to Book 2, I just want to highlight that we'll come back to this point. Okay, now if you accept all those claims, then we get to the end of the argument, the final conclusion, a human being can only achieve her good if she possesses the virtues. But for the moment, I just want to focus on the first part of the argument. Right? I want to focus on this first part of the argument where we see Aristotle arguing to the claim that a human being achieves her good only if she acts in accordance with reason. So we're just focusing on P1 through C1. And I want to think about P1 and I want to think about P2. And I'll be very curious to hear what your thoughts on this argument are in our discussion. And I just want to highlight some questions for you to think about as you're thinking through whether you think this is a good argument or not. So let's look at P1. Something achieves its good only if it accomplishes its function. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do you think it's true that everything has a function and or a purpose? And if so, where do those purposes come from? Now, some of the examples I gave, like a knife or a car, it's easy to say that those things have purposes because human beings made them for that specific purpose. Right? The purpose of a knife is to cut because human beings constructed that knife specifically to serve the purpose of cutting. The purpose of a car is to transport you safely and effectively because that's the purpose we made it for. But now, and even our professions, like being a lawyer or being a doctor, human beings constructed the profession, the medical profession, and so we gave it the purpose of ensuring health for other people. But now think about the purpose of an entire human life. Can we identify where that purpose would come from? Where does our purpose as a human being come from? And in part, this is going to depend on what you think is responsible for human nature. Do you see human nature as the product of a sort of divine plan, merely as the product of evolutionary biology, maybe a product or combination of them both? Right? Because if where a purpose comes from is from whatever created that thing or the source that it came from, then to know whether human beings have a purpose, we need to know a little bit about where is the source that human beings came from. And given that source, does it mean that we have some sort of purpose? So that's the first question. Do we have sufficient evidence to think that human beings, in addition to other things we know have been made or constructed, have a purpose? But the second point is this. So let's say that human beings do have a purpose. And you can decide where you think that purpose comes from for the moment. But does it follow that our lives are made better by achieving that purpose? Right? Because thus far we've sort of been saying, well, look, everything has a purpose, and if it achieves that purpose, it's doing well. But is that always the case? Is it always the case that you would say something is doing well if it achieves its purpose? And here, I want to take a passage that actually comes from Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, so not what you have read thus far, but I think it helps us think through this point. So this passage says, the virtue of the eye, for example, makes it and its characteristic activity good, because it is through the virtue of the eye that we see well. Okay, so that makes sense, yeah. An eye is doing well if it allows us to see properly. Makes sense. But what about, check out the next sentence. Likewise, the virtue of the horse makes a horse good. Good at running, at carrying its rider, and at facing the enemy. So what sort of horse are we imagining here? Well, given his previous examples and what he says here, it seems like we're imagining a horse that's being used in military warfare. Right? Okay, so you say, well, this horse, we'll say that it was the product of human beings who had bred it properly to come into existence. And the reason we brought this horse into existence is so it could serve us in our military endeavors. So you could say, given where this horse came from, its purpose is to allow us to go into battle in a very dangerous circumstance. The purpose of this horse is to carry its rider and face the enemy. Okay, so suppose that horse is doing that. It's carrying human beings into battle, knowing there's a very high probability this horse will die. Does it follow that fulfilling this purpose is actually making the horse's life go better? And not just better, does it follow that because this horse is fulfilling that purpose, its life has achieved its highest good? Well, I could imagine an argument on behalf of the horse that says, look, I'm glad I can help you in this military engagement, but, I wouldn't mind just sort of running around in the wild by myself, maybe eating grass. I don't even know whatever it is that horses eat, eating grass and doing the thing that horses do naturally. Right? So we can imagine an argument on behalf of the horse which would hold that, yeah, I'm achieving this purpose you gave me, but it's not clear this purpose is making my life go better. So now apply this to what Aristotle is saying. Aristotle is saying, well, what makes human beings distinctive is our use of reason and to be able to act in accordance with reason. But is that making your life better? Maybe you might say, yes, I know I have the ability to reason through my actions and do what my reason says best, but I really just prefer to pursue immediate pleasure. I prefer to act in sort of chaotic ways sometimes. I don't like to always think through all my actions. And also, if using reason to dictate my actions means I have to act in an ethical and moral manner, then isn't that going to infringe on my interests? Again, Aren't there situations where I could be dishonest and lie and get what I want? So another question here is, even if Aristotle is right that our purpose is to act in accordance with reason, does it follow that that's actually making our lives better? That's another question to consider. Now, both those questions have to do with P1, but we should also take a look at P2. Is it even true that the function of a human being is activity in accordance with reason? And remember, Aristotle's justification here was that, well, reason is what separates human beings. This must be our purpose, right? Just like the ability to cut is what separates a knife from other tools, that must be the knife's purpose. The ability to reason separates human beings from other species, that must be our purpose. Well, one way to think about whether that's true is to ask yourself, are there any other examples of things that are special or specific to human beings? So here's a couple of philosophers who have criticized Aristotle's claim here by pointing out that there seem to be other activities that are special to human beings. So Bernard Williams, for instance, one famous philosopher, says, if one approached without preconception the question of finding characteristics which differentiate men from other animals, one could as well, on these principles, end up with a morality which exhorted man to spend as much time as possible in making fire, developing peculiarly human physical characteristics, having sexual intercourse without regard to season, despoiling the environment, upsetting the balance of nature, or killing things for fun. These all seem to be activities which are particular to the human species and not found in other species. Why not say that making fire, or having sex without regard to season, or hunting other animals for fun and enjoyment is our purpose? Or another way that Robert Nozick put it, another philosopher who criticized Aristotle here, if man turned out to be unique only in having a sense of humor, would it follow that we should concentrate his energies on inventing and telling jokes? So if it is true, and it seems reasonable that, I'm not an expert here, but on this particular topic, but it seems reasonable to think that humor is something that is innate and special to the human species. Why not say, actually our purpose is not action in accordance with reason. Our purpose is actually to be as funny and humorous and tell as many jokes as we can. So the basic structure of the objection is that, yes, reason does differentiate us, but many other things differentiate us as well. So why is Aristotle so focused on our ability to reason? So I'll be interested to see what you think here. Can you defend Aristotle on this point? Is there some reason that we should see the use of rationality and reason in guiding our actions as our purpose instead of being humorous or making fire? So again, I'll be interested to see what you think. I will stop the video there. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.